I'm going to give you a bit of an overview about Joan of Arc. Some of you are familiar with her story. If you've taken like H113 Western Civ with me, you're going to be like, yeah, I know this, get to the good stuff. But we got to have the background to understand Joan and why she's such an important figure and why so many people in the modern era are going to use her in various ways. And so I'm going to spend the first part of my talk giving you that background. And then I'm going to talk about the two particular wartime treatises I looked at for this particular project. One is from the US Civil War, and it was written by a guy who's associated with the Confederates. And the other is from World War I, written by a Belgian guy who was a professor at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, who's writing for American troops in World War I. So a very complex situation there. I want to talk just very briefly, though, before we get into that background, about fascination with Joan of Arc and representations of her. If you were to search just simply Joan of Arc on Google, anyone want to guess how many hits you'd get searching for Joan of Arc? What do you think?
3 million.
3 million? Okay. 5 million? 17,600,000 is the correct answer. Yeah, she's all over the place. And so we have to try to understand why that's the case, why so many people are so kind of fascinated by her. On the PowerPoint here, I just have some representations of Joan, mostly in kind of commercial ways. This is from an early film called The Passion of Joan of Arc from 1928 that features Joan's trial and execution. The Ringling Brothers put on a circus show featuring Joan of Arc, a pageant of sorts, in the early 20th century. And then there were comic books produced in the 50s about Joan from this Classics Illustrated series that looked at figures from the past. Joan has been used very commercially in various ways as well. There is still a brand today called Joan of Arc beans. That picture is from Walmart.com. You can buy Joan of Arc beans online today. You might even see them on the shelf in the store. She's been used to sell brie cheese. She's been used to sell cigars. I don't know why. But she's been used to sell a lot of commodities. And so what is it about her that people are so fascinated by? For me, I think it's because she's a highly malleable figure. You can kind of shape her and change her in various ways to stand for whatever you stand for. And so that is one reason I think people have used her image a lot. She's also someone who did extraordinary things. She was a 17-year-old illiterate peasant girl who rode up to the guy who wanted to be king of France and told him she could save France. That's not something that happened during the Middle Ages. That's not something that really happens now. And so that's pretty extraordinary. She also died at a very early age in a very, seemingly very tragic way. She was burned at the stake. And so we also can see a lot of people use her image for religious purposes to emphasize that she is a Catholic martyr, and she is indeed a saint in the Catholic Church as well. And so you're going to see her being used in all these ways for all of these reasons. She's not unique in this, though. She's not the only historical figure to be used by people to stand for whatever they stand for. Just think in this country how much people want to associate themselves with, let's say, Abraham Lincoln, or shout out to Dr. Melanson here, with George Washington. We have figures like this that we want to associate ourselves with. But Joan stands out, and she's going to be used by people from various countries to stand for whatever they stand for. So I want to give you some background so you can help hopefully understand why that's the case based on some of the details from her short but extraordinary life. Now, Joan is going to make her mark on history in the context of a war called the 100 Years' War. This is a war between England and France. It happened for a big chunk of the Middle Ages from 1337 to 1453. It wasn't continuous warfare, but it was a pretty big struggle between the English and French over a couple of things. English kings possessed land in France. In particular, they had a big province called Aquitaine in southern France under their control. And the English king, actually, in the 1320s, is going to be in line to be the king of France as well. And so that's going to lead to a big conflict. In 1328, the King of England, this guy you see here, Edward III, had just become King of England the previous year, and the King of France died. Now, for 350 years in France, there had been one royal family in control, and they had always had a son to succeed the father, and so everything went really smoothly for this family for a long time. In 1328, the last direct descendant in this family died. And so your French nobles go look at the genealogy charts. They're trying to figure out who's the next rightful king of France. They go through the charts and they find out, uh-oh, it's the King of England, Edward III. Would you want, if you were the French nobles, to be ruled over by a guy who takes part of your territory and wants to take more of it? Probably not, right? And so the French nobles say, we're going to find a different plan here. We're going to make Edward III ineligible because he claims his connection to French royalty through his mother, and we're going to say it's illegitimate to claim it through a woman. And so that's what the French nobles do, and they appoint a new king. And so they elect a guy named Philip VI. Edward III of England is actually okay with this for the moment. He says, okay, as long as you guys stay out of Aquitaine and you let me keep this highlighted strip of land you see here and leave me alone down there, I won't contest this, all right? I don't need to be King of France, it's fine. The French nobles started moving into Aquitaine really soon after they crowned a new king, so they don't listen to Edward III. Eventually, this is going to lead to this war touching off in 1337. Now, the war raged on for a while. For the first 3/4 of this war, the English dominate. The English look like they're winning basically every engagement. France is looking pretty bad. Most famously, the English are going to win a huge victory at a place called Agincourt in 1415 under King Henry V. Anyone who's read the Shakespeare play or seen the Kenneth Branagh movie, you probably know a little bit about Henry V. Henry V did something interesting, though, when he won the Battle of Agincourt. He went up to the French king, who was an old man at this point, who also suffered from some kind of debilitating mental illness, so he's pretty unstable in his power. And Henry V said, you're going to sign a treaty with me, and according to this treaty, when you die, I will be the King of France. All right, so we're finally going to get an English king who's also King of France. That's the idea. To kind of seal the deal, Henry says, I'm going to marry your daughter, too. Okay, so we'll make it all official here. Unfortunately for old Henry, he's never going to get to be King of France. He dies in 1422. The King of France dies soon after. And so now we're left with a huge question. Who's the rightful King of France? Who's actually supposed to be in charge here? This is going to be the situation that Joan of Arc enters into, all right? We've got two people who claim the throne. On the one hand, you have Henry V's son, who's Henry VI of England. He can't claim the throne himself because he can't talk. He's like 9 months old at this point. But he rules England with regents ruling on his behalf. There's a couple of dukes who rule on behalf of little baby Henry VI, but he's technically the King of England at this point. His regents say he's the rightful King of France, all right? So we'll rule on his behalf until he's 18, it'll be fine. But the dead King of France has a son too. This son was going to get passed over according to this treaty, but now he's saying, the treaty is null and void. The treaty only applied to Henry V. I'm the rightful king. This guy's name is Charles, and he's known by the title that the inheritors of the French throne are known by, the Dauphin. So he's Dauphin Charles. It's kind of like Prince of Wales in England. And so he says, I'm the rightful king of France. And so we're going to end up with another power struggle in England over in France, over who gets to rule. When you hear stuff like this, thank your lucky stars for democracy, right? That you're not being ruled over by a 9-month-old. In any case, though, we're going to have a situation where Henry VI becomes the King of France, at least temporarily. So your 9-month-old is the King of England and the King of France. And it shakes out like this on the map. We'll go back to Joan in just a second. On the map, you can see here, in the pink, these are lands that recognize Henry VI as the true King of France. So it's northern France, and most significantly, the city of Paris, which even at this point was the capital of this kingdom and the richest city in this kingdom. In the green, these are all places that recognize Dauphin Charles. And so we've ended up with a split France in 1429. Technically, Charles is not crowned and he's not the king. But he's got a bunch of people who say he really is the king, we follow him. And they're all in this green area here. The English are trying to expand further into the Dauphin's territory by besieging the city of Orléans, right there. You can see it's right on the edge. It's controlled by the Dauphin, but it's right on the edge of English-controlled territory. If the English are able to besiege and take this town, they are going to move southward, and they are going to be able to take over, probably, a lot of this territory from the Dauphin. This is the situation that Joan of Arc arrives in. And so think of how desperate the Dauphin probably felt at this moment. The Dauphin has a lot of problems. He is well known at this point in his life as a ditherer. He doesn't do much. He says, I'm going to do one thing, and then he changes his mind, and he goes back and forth. And so he never kind of gets off his throne that he's created for himself and does anything to strike against the English. Things are so bad that his own mother started telling him, I'm going to switch sides if you don't do something now. And so there's a lot of frustration among the Dauphin's partisans. The other problem he has is he doesn't really have a lot of money, all right? So he's kind of struggling to decide what to do here. Joan of Arc is going to arrive at the Dauphin's court in 1429. She will arrive dressed in armor, but she is a 17-year-old peasant girl, okay? She is actually technically not from France. As weird as that may sound, because she's so associated with France, the territory she comes from is this yellow territory you see over here, the Duchy of Burgundy. The Duke there had taken the opportunity of all the chaos of the war to just break away from anybody's authority, and so he ruled independently. And Joan lived in this yellow section here. A lot of the people in this yellow section, though, were partisans of the Dauphin, okay? So they championed the Dauphin and France in general. Now, Joan doesn't just randomly arrive at the court of the Dauphin. She has the support of local people from where she's from, including some pretty powerful people, a powerful knight, for example, from her local community. And so a letter has been sent ahead of her to the court, announcing who she is and kind of what the deal is with her. The deal with Joan is that she hears voices, all right? The letter reports that Joan hears voices from the saints who are telling her that God has a mission for her, and that mission is to save France. Now, when you think about it, now that would seem kind of strange to someone. In 1429, it sounds really strange to people. This random 17-year-old girl is going to save France. There was actually, though, a prophecy that had circulated in France for a while now. The prophecy was supposed to have dated back to Merlin, that wizard you've probably heard of, the magician from the King Arthur tales. But this prophecy stated that when France is in peril, France will be saved, it will be redeemed by a young virgin girl. And so with that in mind, someone like Joan is going to be believed more than she might have been otherwise. She's also going to be believed more than she might have been otherwise because people are desperate. The Dauphin has no clue what to do. This looks like an opportunity for him. And so when she arrives dressed in armor, she's this kind of extraordinary sight. The Dauphin is not super sure about what to do with her. He has her questioned. He has her questioned by ecclesiastical officials, by church officials. And they say, you know what, we've interrogated her, and we think the voices she's hearing are truly sent by God. We think she's truly a messenger of God, and so we think you should give her some kind of authority here. Now, we don't know the extent to which Joan is actually going to be out there on the battlefield killing people, okay? We do know that she does ride out in battle. We don't know how far she was involved in battle plans, but she was definitely, and there's no reservations in saying this, seen as a symbol by the French army, a rallying symbol. She did fight. She did actually get injured when she's fighting as well. And so she does act as a soldier. We just don't know the extent to which she does that. And so she is definitely given some kind of authority and given this kind of role as the symbol of the French army. This illustration that you see over here on the right, by the way, this is the only known depiction of Joan that was actually drawn during her lifetime. This one's a little later, but both of these symbols here, you can see Joan. She's got this weird dress on here, so I don't know if this is like an armored dress. I don't know if that's a thing, but she's got armor on over here. In both of the images, though, you see her banner. This is something Joan mentions frequently. She carries a banner into battle with her, a white banner that's inscribed with the words, Jesus Maria, okay? So she's fighting for God, for the Virgin Mary, okay? So she rides into battle at Orleans. She and the troops with her break the siege of Orleans, and they push the English back. Something that hadn't been done to this point, something that they didn't think they'd be able to do, they did. The French see it as a miracle. The English say Joan's a witch, all right? They say she couldn't have done it unless she was, influenced by Satan. Right? It's not God who's driving her, it's Satan she thinks she's hearing these voices. They're from the devil. And so this victory at Orleans is going to be a huge deal. This is not any minor victory here. As a result of this victory, Charles, our Dauphin, is so emboldened by what has happened that he marches from Chinon, where his little court was, right here, all the way up to the northern corner of France, into English territory, to the town where French kings are traditionally crowned, and he has himself crowned by the bishop there, and he becomes King Charles VII of France. He's directly competing with Henry VI. All right? He's challenging this idea that the English are in charge of this pink territory up here. And so Joan is responsible for finally motivating Charles to do something. And so this is going to be a big turning point in the war. Eventually, the French are going to win this war, but Joan is not going to be a part of that victory. Joan says that her voices are still talking to her after Orleans. They tell her to attack Paris. She tries. She fails. She starts to lose the support of people who are following the Charles VII now, actually. And she starts losing the support of Charles as well. After another loss, she's actually captured by people from her own territory, Burgundy. The people from Burgundy decide, we're going to sell her to the highest bidder. The highest bidder is going to be the English. Charles can't be bothered to kind of purchase her, this woman who had a big part in saving his kingdom. She's put on trial for heresy in French territory, but it's controlled by the English. The people who try her are all French clergy members, but they're colluding or collaborating with the English. And she's interrogated for a few months, actually, about the things she did, about the voices she heard, about the visions she saw. And ultimately, even though she's resistant for a long time at this trial, she's either worn down, she may have been tortured in the times that she was not in the courtroom, and ultimately she does confess to charges, including that her voices were false, and that she realizes now, one of the charges she confesses to, is that she should never have dressed as a man on the battlefield. The clergy told her this is a violation of a law code in Deuteronomy, so in an Old Testament book. And so she's charged with all these things. She confesses. And then a couple of days later, she goes back on her confession. She says, never mind, I didn't mean it. Because she's what's called a relapsed heretic, so someone who's sort of resisting the power of the church, her ideas are wrong and she's sticking to them, she's turned over to secular authorities and she's burned at the stake in May 1431. Now, if you are Charles VII, you're feeling probably a little bad about this, although at the time he was kind of like, whatever. But 25 years later, he's still the king and he's much more secure in his rule. And so 25 years later, he reopens her trial. She's dead, right? It's a posthumous trial. But the trial is run by friendly French clergy, and they say, yeah, she was an authentic visionary. Guys before us, they messed it up. Sorry about that, Joan. And so they rehabilitate her reputation, basically. So for a while there, she had been considered damned, and now she's saved again. It takes a very long time, though, for her to be made a saint. She is canonized or made a saint by the Catholic Church in 1920, right? Well, so what does that mean for the way her symbol is used between 1456 and 1920? Well, it's going to be used in lots of different ways. I want to concentrate, though, first on how it's used in the 19th century. Joan's image is used all over the place in the 19th century. There are a lot of new tellings of her story produced by European and American authors. There's new paintings and sculptures and other visual representations of her. In the 19th century, some of you probably know about a movement known as the Romantic movement. And a big part of the Romantic movement was this idea that the Middle Ages were full of chivalry and knights and ladies and all this stuff, and you want to revive that idea. And so by a lot of 19th century authors, Joan was seen in this kind of romantic way. She was a young child, driven by voices from God. It's all very nice in most 19th century tellings. Well, so how are you going to use her then in the context of her being a warrior? That's going to come up more frequently later on in the 19th century. In the US Civil War, Joan is going to make frequent appearances in propaganda on both the northern side and the southern side of the conflict. On the northern side, just to give you a taste of what propaganda was like there was a young girl named Anna Dickinson, who you see here. She was a Quaker. She was also an abolitionist. She was about 17 years old, and she went around making speeches condemning slavery. She spoke at, among other places, the U.S. Congress, and so she has this big voice in the lead up to the Civil War. She talks about Joan of Arc in the speeches that she makes. She connects herself with Joan of Arc in her speeches, and people connected her with Joan. They called her the Joan of Arc of the Union cause and the American Joan of Arc. In contrast, in the South, you're going to see a really interesting use of her image in really a pamphlet by a guy named John Fenton Hill. Fenton Hill's pamphlet, and it's kind of long, it's 75 pages, longish pamphlet. His pamphlet is called Joan of Arc, An Opinion of Her Life and Character from Ancient Chronicles. All right, so the title announces, I'm going to be looking at real stories from the past about Joan and telling you about her. He's kind of lying here because he's going to make up a bunch of stuff about Joan. So he's going to use her image and shape it to speak for his cause. His cause is the Confederate cause in the U.S. Civil War. In his work, which was published in Richmond in 1864, he's going to start off with a prologue or a preface, and then move into a brief sketch of Joan's life, where he makes some interesting remarks about who she was. And then he's going to talk about her mode of fighting, painting her to be a fierce warrior who's very willing to shed blood. This is very different than most of the 19th century depictions of Joan, where she's depicted as being very reluctant to actually fight. And then he's going to spend the latter part of the book arguing that she was not a Catholic martyr, but she's actually a Protestant. All right, so we'll see how he does that in just a second. The preface to this work is amazing. He says that he's been writing this work for a long time, and he decided now was the time to finally have it published. In the preface, there's all kinds of strikingly violent language. Fenton Hill sees a very neat parallel between the French-English clash in the 100 Years' War and the desperation of the French with his own cause, the Confederate cause. He sees the Confederate cause kind of fading in 1864. He wants to inspire people through the use of Joan of Arc to fight back, to fight harder. And so what he writes is that the war has dragged on too long for the Confederates because they've had an unwillingness to risk it all and kind of stake their identity on the outcome of the war. They've been too genteel, they've been too Southern throughout this whole time. They need to go strike against those Union troops. This is 1864. I guess he's forgetting about like Gettysburg and all that other stuff. But he's saying, we got to go strike. We got to go to their land, into the heart of their land, and get them. They're overrunning our territory. We got to reverse it on them. And so to that end, he says, we've got to raise the black flag. We must exterminate every Yankee force that invades our soil, and we must carry fire and sword into the country of our enemies. According to Fenton Hill, this is what Joan of Arc did. She went into English territory in France, and she came at them with fire and sword. He believes that Joan of Arc fought a war of extermination, that she was trying to eliminate all the English. And they need to do this by any means necessary. And so his Joan is a very violent Joan who's willing to shed as much blood as possible for a just cause. Okay? He says his cause is just like Joan's cause was just. And so he goes on to describe her as a very intense kind of fighter in his work. Again, very different than other 19th century depictions. He decries a lot of the myths and legends that have grown up about Joan to this point, and argues that she has to be seen, first of all, as a fighter more than anything else. He's going to reject this idea that she's just young and childlike and all of that. He's also going to reject the reality that she was 17 years old when she went to the court at Chinon. He argues that she was born in 1400 and therefore was 28 when she went to the court. Now, this is demonstrably false. He knows this is wrong, but he wants to play up the idea of Joan as a mature warrior, not as a child at all. And so he really emphasizes that idea. Unlike most of his contemporaries, he's really going to stick with this idea that she is a crusader, and a crusader who's willing to spill all kinds of blood. He says she's someone who slew the marauding enemy with no more compunction than she would have felt in slaying a wolf that was destroying her father's flock. All right, so it's got to be a war of extermination for the Confederates following Joan's example. Now, on that religious front, he does have some interesting things to add there. He argues that Joan is not the committed Catholic that she appears to be, but she's actually an early Protestant, a reformer of the church. He has this whole section where he says, the Reformation got its start before Luther, which is true. We've got a bunch of movements kind of happening before that point. He tries to link Joan specifically with the movement of this man, Jan Hus, who was a reformer who lived in Prague, so over in what is today the Czech Republic. Jan Hus's ideas, according to Fenton-Hill, mesh with Joan's ideas. Okay? Now, he freely admits, I have no evidence that she ever saw any of his ideas, she had any connection with him, but I think she was one of his people. I think that she was driven by the same ideas he was driven by. He was executed by the Catholic Church, by the state, with the help of the Catholic Church as well, in the year 1415. So he draws this parallel there. He does this despite the fact that we have evidence that Joan actually dictated a letter to Jan Hus's followers in the year 1430. This letter, among other things, said to his followers, if you don't stop following his ideas, I'll relieve you of either your heresy or your life. All right? So in this letter, she's basically saying, if I weren't so busy fighting the English, I'd come and kill all of you. So there's your fierce fighter, but you're a committed Catholic as well. All right? And so Fenton-Hill's ideas about Joan's religion are a way to take his Protestantism and kind of impose it on Joan, so shaping her to fit what he wants her to be. The way that he molds her to mesh with his own ideas is no different than some other people did. His is maybe a little bit more extreme, but other people did this as well. And Joan continues to be a powerful symbol after the 19th century. In the context of World War I, she's going to emerge as an incredibly powerful symbol. Now I want to take just a little minute here and give you a little musical interlude. This is a song written by Americans in 1917 called Joan of Arc, They Are Calling You, that has been recently the audio has been recovered in recent years and preserved. So I'm just going to play a little bit of this song. The lyrics are over there on the screen. Okay, so I'm sure you hear the echoes of the French national anthem in that song as well. Joan had become, in the early 20th century, a very important political symbol in French politics in particular. By the time we get to the late 19th and early 20th century, she's an especially big figure on the French right, so on the right of politics, the more conservative, the side that is associated most with the Catholic Church, not surprisingly. In 1909, she was beatified, which is the next step before canonization, before you're made a saint. And then in World War I, she's going to be used extensively in propaganda. We have an American song where American fighters are being told, Joan of Arc is kind of their guiding spirit here. We see her used in propaganda posters in World War I. We've got a version for women of Britain, a version for women of America here. Joan of Arc saved France. You save France by buying war bonds, basically. So don't copy her. Don't go out on the battlefield. Please don't do that. But you can buy war bonds, and so you can do your part to save France. And so she becomes this really important, powerful symbol in World War I. Many people write about Joan during this era, including a man named Charles Sarolea, who you see in that portrait there. Sarolea, as I mentioned at the beginning, is a Belgian-born man. He became a language professor at the University of Edinburgh in 1894, and he's going to remain in Scotland for the rest of his life. He still associates himself with Belgium, though, and so when Belgium is overrun by German troops, he's going to launch a relief effort to try to help save his fellow Belgians. Throughout his life, his political views are very changeable, as you will see, but he remains committed to the idea of peace in Europe through any means, so he's willing to go very far to get peace, and he remains committed to not just his Catholicism, but to Christianity more broadly. Those are the two big things he stands for. Beginning in 1912, he edited a journal called Everyman that tackled a bunch of subjects from kind of a worldly cosmopolitan perspective, but British politics from a conservative Catholic perspective. And so both of his perspectives are kind of observed in this journal. When the war broke out, as I mentioned, he set up a relief fund through his journal for Belgium, and he went on a speaking tour of the United States in 1915. He was trying to get the Americans to enter the war. It did not go well, especially because one thing he did while he was there is he widely praised Russia, and Americans didn't like that. In fact, his fellow Britons didn't like that, and neither did the French. Nobody liked Russia. But they had to fight alongside Russia against the Germans. And so this got him a lot of blowback in the United States, but he continued to praise Russia in 1916. He wrote a work called Europe's Debt to Russia and Great Russia, Her Achievement and Promise, both in 1916. Because he's praising Russia as sort of a bastion of Christianity and benevolent monarchy, is how he sees it, he's definitely going to be also supporting France as a sort of bastion of religion and kind of peace and so on. He's going to hate Germany, though, during these years. Not surprising, because Germans overran his homeland of Belgium. He wrote a work called The Anglo-German Problem in 1912, even before the war, emphasizing that there was going to be a clash soon between the English and the Germans. During the war, he wrote a work called German Problems and Personalities, where he talks frequently about the idea of the barbaric Hun. He is not alone in these sentiments. Anyone who's seen World War I propaganda, you might have seen images of like the hulking Hun over a dying French woman or something like that. We've got this idea of the Germans portrayed as evil by the Allies during this war. Sarolea made some connections during his US trip, even though he kind of got booed from the stage in a lot of places. The connections he made were pretty important ones. He is commissioned in 1918, after the Americans finally did enter the war, by the YMCA of the American Army and Navy to write a work about Joan of Arc. Now, this work wasn't just meant for anybody, it was meant specifically for American soldiers who are now fighting in France on Joan of Arc's land. A lot of troops are fighting in eastern France, where Joan was from. And there's a sense that the troops want to know more about her so that they can kind of understand the land that they're fighting in. You got to think about a lot of these guys don't have much of an education. They're overseas for the first time. And there's a sense that they actually want to know a little bit about the history of the country that they're fighting in. The YMCA was particularly devoted to a large-scale education program for soldiers. They believed that you could train better soldiers through education, and so they set up these huge barracks in France, run by the YMCA, but helped out by professors from places like Yale. And they trained soldiers in history, geography, all kinds of other subjects. The other goal of this education program was to better prepare members of the Army for a long period of demobilization. There's a sense that the war is going to end relatively soon, and that demobilization for a lot of these guys is going to leave them stuck in Europe for a while before they can get back home to the US. And so if we educate them, as a guide about this whole program states, we will prepare them better to take their places on returning as workers in a modern democracy. And so education is seen as the way to make them good workers in the United States. And so Sarolea is commissioned to write this guide that he ends up calling The Maid of Orleans. Sarolea had long been an admirer of Joan, so this is not new information for him. He included her image in his journal frequently, and especially praised her as a Catholic hero in his journal. And so he's very happy to write this work. He's going to cast Joan as He talks about her Catholicism, but more broadly, he talks about her spirituality. And so for him, above all else, she is a spiritual hero, a model that the troops can follow. His Joan is willing to fight, but she is not the bloodthirsty Joan of Fenton Hill's work. So Sarah Raleigh, the first part of his work, he calls it the miracle of Joan of Arc. Says, she was a miraculous being, and she can teach us important lessons today. For him, Joan is a triumph of patriotism. She's a triumph of preeminent virtue, the victory of transcendent faith, and she teaches us that even in warfare, it is mainly the spiritual forces that count. Fenton Hill would look at this and say, nah, it's the sword that counts, right? So he's got a slightly different interpretation of Joan. He continues on, kind of gives some biographical details and so on about Joan, but I want to mention the last section of his work, which is called Joan of Arc and the Soul of France. In this part, Sarah Leah does a couple of different really interesting things with Joan of Arc's image. First of all, he uses her image and her kind of striving for justice and all the other things he attaches to her to connect the French with the Americans. So he's trying to show these American soldiers who are going to read this book that Providence, God, has made the French brethren in arms of the American people. And so fight with your allies. So that's one point he makes with Joan. Another point he makes with Joan is that she's representative of a French culture and civilization that is way better than German culture and civilization. And he spends several pages kind of going on somewhat interminably about how wonderful French culture is and how all German culture tends to the same thing. For him, the Germans are relentless in their rancor and merciless in their vindictiveness. All they think about is vengeance, all right? Whereas Joan and French culture is much more pure for Sarah Leah. And so that's another way he uses her image. Finally, though, he does play up the idea of Joan as fighter in this last part of his book. He says, Joan is a crusader for justice. And so she will kind of give you an example of what you must do, American troops. Thou shalt repel the Teuton as the Maid of Orleans repelled the invader, the German, right? And the last part of this book is full of like thee and thou and thy. It's like he's trying to talk from on high almost in this last section. So connecting Joan to religion, connecting her to French culture and civilization, connecting her to this idea of crusading for a just cause. So once again, we're molding her to fit the idea of this just cause. After the war, by the way, Sarah Leah, we know he had championed Russia as this paragon of Christianity and as a bulwark against German aggression. He is definitely going to be horrified when the Bolsheviks take over in Russia because they are going to reject Christianity, right? And so he's going to basically drop Russia after 1924, especially. He's got to look around, though. He's someone who thinks there has to be a leader in Europe to keep the peace. And so he looks around for a leader, and the leader he settles on is Germany. Just a few years ago, he'd been saying, you're all terrible Huns. Now he's like, Germany, you guys have some good leadership qualities here. He's actually really upset with how things went post-war. He's mad at the Versailles Treaty. He thinks the Germans were mistreated. He's mad at the League of Nations. He thinks they're doing bad things rather than good things. And so ultimately, he starts looking at Germany as a potential new savior for Europe. And when I said he's willing to go just about anywhere with his ideas to secure European peace, he actually is going to start saying, I think the Nazis have some good ideas here, all right? He becomes, for all intents and purposes, a fascist in the 1930s. He is going to be welcomed to Germany in 1937. He will go, at that point, to one of the Nuremberg rallies and meet Hitler in 1937. And upon his return to Scotland, he gives a series of lectures entitled The Scottish Roots of the Nazi Religion, in which he argues that Nazism is based on the theories of a 19th century Scottish philosopher named Thomas Carlyle, who had a theory about the great man being needed to dominate everything to lead to peace, all right? And so he is going to be a big fan of Germany after having rejected them for so long. As much as Sarah Leah changes and shifts his own political ideas, people have changed and shifted the way they use Joan of Arc. All right, we've seen different ways to use her image, and this continues to this day. And so this is kind of like, this stuff is all very interesting, but why does it still matter to us today? People are still using Joan as an important political symbol today. In particular, in France, she has emerged once again as a figure widely used by the political right. This is an image of Marine Le Pen, who was a candidate for president of France in 2012. 2012 was also the 600th anniversary of Joan's birth. And so French politicians scrambled to make a bunch of speeches and sort of air their political views and associate them with Joan. For Marine Le Pen, who's from the far-right National Front Party, Joan was willing to expel the English. Marine Le Pen connects that to the National Front's idea of expelling and not welcoming immigrants more generally. Oops, that's my alarm. There we go. And so expelling immigrants kind of more generally and not welcoming them at all. And so the idea that Joan would have stood for that is Marine Le Pen. In that same election year, Nicolas Sarkozy, who was also running, tried to make Joan a much more inclusive figure that stands for all French, including immigrants who've come over to France. And so her image was used in different ways in 2012. However, it's really been something that sticks with the far right above all else. Joan has been used continuously up till this day with the National Front Party. Marine Le Pen is running for president again of France this year, and her niece, Marion Le Pen, is a rising star in French politics. She's also a member of the same party. Marine Le Pen became a member of parliament at the age of 22, the youngest member of French parliament ever, and she continues to be an important political force today. When a French Catholic priest was killed in France by a Muslim, she joined the reserves of the army in 2015. And this led a political provocateur to write about her, "France is under attack, but I'll show you a 21st century Joan of Arc who just might be the one to save the country. A young woman joining the armed forces and calling upon all patriotic French to do so too." And so Joan is being cast here in the image of Marion Le Pen as the one who will drive out the invaders, the Muslim invaders. And so we have this very kind of strong alliance here. In looking around at this, I also found a quote from Sarah Palin, of all people, who associated Marion Le Pen with Joan of Arc as well and said, I really like her, she's great. She's the new Joan of Arc. And so we have the sense that right politics worldwide are kind of continuing to use Joan as a symbol. That doesn't mean she's not going to be used as a symbol by other people continuing on throughout the years. She can be used in so many different ways. She stands for faith, she stands for justice, she stands for determination, and just about anyone wants to associate themselves with those things. All right, thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions, right? Yeah. Brian, I see a hand sort of half up.
Oh.
Are you stretching?
Well, I had one kind of question. It was with Henry VI. I know she said, people were going to kind of rule him. It's for him until he was of age, and you said 18. Was that actually the true age, or were you using that to refer to adulthood?
Just adulthood. I think they actually let him start ruling when he was around 16. But then the problem is he seems to have inherited whatever mental illness, and it's unclear what it was, from his grandfather. And he was actually incapable of ruling for 2 separate periods during his time in power. That's going to allow the French to keep pushing those victories beyond that point. So he'll be pretty ineffective because of that.
Did you come across any sources that wrote about Joan in a negative light, like the Germans in World War I? Did they speak out against Joan?
It's fascinating. When you look at the propaganda kind of over the years, you don't see a lot of negative stuff. If you look at some early English stuff, you can see some negative ideas. Joan of Arc does appear as a character in Shakespeare's Henry VI, and in that work she's described as a puzzle, which is a word that could mean, mysterious, but it also in England at that time meant whore. And so we have this idea that she's not depicted very positively in a work by Shakespeare. But looking at World War I propaganda, the Germans instead focus on, they have sort of positive images of a sort of I can't remember the name of, like a Valkyrie, like a, a sort of woman sort of striving for Germany, but you don't see like negative images of Joan. So most of what you see is very positive. I'm going to dig a little deeper on that because I'm wondering myself if there'd be more like things kind of lampooning her, like political cartoons making fun of her, that kind of thing. But I haven't come across much of that. Yeah.
Do you think one of the reasons why her image is so malleable is because of her age, her being so young and kind of innocent and naive that they can just manipulate it however they want, no matter what it is?
Yeah, I think that's a good point because you can either play up her youth and kind of play up her sort of innocence and the idea that God chose her because of that, if that's what you want to emphasize, or you can kind of play up the, I can't believe someone so young could accomplish something like this angle. And so that helps people be able to kind of shape her image. I think another reason for it is because her life in the public eye was so short. It's just a couple of years. And so we don't have a case where, you know, she wins a battle and then things kind of decline and then she just goes off and retires to some village somewhere and people are like, who's this crazy old lady? She used to be Joan of Arc, whatever. You know, she doesn't have that long past or that long future ahead of her. And so that makes her this kind of enigmatic, mysterious figure and someone who people try to explain, how did she have such a big impact in such a short period of time? And then, you know, why did they let her die is a big part of it as well. And so I think there's a lot of factors working there, but her youth is definitely a big part of it. Yeah.
Where does witchcraft fit into everything? Like, what is her place in the history of punishing women as witches, or what role does being a witch play into her story?
She is being punished mostly as a heretic, but she is called a witch, and so there is some issue there. The 15th century, when she's being tried, is right at the period where heresy, which is in the Catholic Church, the crime is basically following different religious beliefs or practices than the majority church, and a lot of people are being accused of heresy during the Middle Ages. Some people are being questioned by inquisitors, and increasingly we see people being executed. They're executed by the state, though. They're turned over from the church to the state. And so she's right in that period where we're shifting from looking at everything as just heresy to there being a specific crime of witchcraft. And so for her, it's kind of a mixed bag. After her, though, you're going to see more people who are simply being said they are witches. It's witchcraft, and heresy is not really so much talked about. And the big thing becomes they're consorting with demons or with Satan. And so Joan's voices are said to be from Satan. And so you see the beginnings of it there, but she's right at a period where things are really rapidly changing on that front.
Yeah. How did the men in her army that she was leading, how did they feel about following her?
The records that we have talk about the vast majority of the people serving with her being absolutely devoted to her. There's a notion that she really was able to inspire the people that she fought with. You know, there's some little misgivings by some people who are actually running the army who are like, we have to deal with this girl and all of that. But especially when there's that victory at Orleans, everybody fighting with her sees her as what drove that victory. She is widely celebrated in France during her lifetime. In fact, in 1430, one of the most famous writers of the day, who also happened to be a woman, named Christine de Pizan, wrote a song about Joan of Arc where she says she's more powerful and better than any biblical hero, than any male soldier who's ever lived. She tops them all, and she's going to continue doing it into the future. Of course, that didn't happen. But in France, her reputation is just absolutely unblemished. And so when Charles kind of drops her, people are really angry. Yeah, and so we do see a lot of anger towards him because of that. There's some stories of people trying to break her out of jail. You know, it's hard to know what actually happened there, but there's definitely a sense that she was very popular among her troops and in France more generally.
In the research you've done, have you come across anything that indicates how well known Joan of Arc was at any of the different historical periods you're looking at? Because, like, I wonder if part of the reason she's malleable beyond her age is also just she's broadly known but not specifically known. Like, people have this vague image but don't know much specific about her.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. When you think about it, though, she was pretty well known, and the problem, though, I think is that people knew kind of the highlights, right? So they'd know, oh, she was a Catholic martyr, oh, she fought with the troops in some war, maybe it was with England, I don't know. But, you know, they had general ideas about her, maybe more so than people do today, because she was so widely used in 19th and 20th century propaganda and commercial stuff and so on. But I do think that might be part of it. You can kind of play up one aspect that people have a vague idea about to fit whatever you want her to be. And so I'm also working on a project on Joan in children's books, 20th century American children's books. And some of them are very specifically from Catholic publishers. And so they're going to be saying, we're going to emphasize Joan as a Catholic martyr above all else. And those kids at those Catholic schools are probably pretty well versed in that, maybe not as well versed on the other parts of her life. And so, yeah, I think that definitely is playing a role. But she was pretty familiar to a lot of people, ultimately.
So you mentioned she's used a lot among conservatives and like on the right. Does anyone like deal with her non-traditional gender role, which like would not usually go along with those ideals?
They either don't deal with it or they see it as, what she needed to do to win, that kind of thing. You do not see people on the political right, especially not in like the 19th century, saying, note how she wore men's clothing into battle and really emphasizing it. In other parts of, other political and social spectrums, people do talk about that and kind of play that up. And so they take another aspect of her life and say, this is important to me, and so that's what I'm going to emphasize. But yeah, the politicians who work with her image usually don't do that. And oftentimes you do see women, especially now, trying to associate themselves with her and emphasizing not really her femininity, but emphasizing that she was a woman rather than emphasizing dressing in male clothing.
I've heard claims that Joan of Arc may have been mentally ill with hearing voices. I was wondering in your research if you've come across anything about that.
What I tend to think about that, and what a lot of people who are medievalists like me think about that, is that it's hard to take people from the past and diagnose them. I mentioned, the French king seems to have suffered from some kind of mental illness, so did Henry VI. We pull from the sources what we can about that. So we hear that Henry VI at one point is totally capable and fine, and then the source says he couldn't do anything, and so we had to kind of put him away. With Joan, you have some people saying, the voices come from God or they don't come from God, but you don't have a big trend in the Middle Ages, at least in the sources we have available, to say people who hear voices are crazy. In the Middle Ages, actually, this notion of madness was actually often embraced, with the idea being that God is speaking to this person in particular. And so they're favored in a way. We might shut them up somewhere, but they're favored in a way. And so you don't see any sources from the 15th century saying, I think she may be crazy necessarily. Instead, they say her voices are coming from Satan rather than God. And so modern historians try not to do that too much. There was a period earlier in the 20th century where something called psychohistory was pretty popular, where you tried to kind of analyze the personalities of figures from the past. And so some people have tried to diagnose her with something. But when we look at her in context, it's best to try not to do something like that. It makes us have to think kind of harder about why she would be so widely accepted by the French, and why people wouldn't be like dismissive of her and just call her crazy. And so it's hard to do, but that's something that I think most modern historians try to shy away from. Yeah.
Is it possible that during her trial she actually did convince some of the judges that she was hearing the saints' voices, but they were politically motivated to not accept it?
Yeah, I mean, we have a transcript of the trial, which is great. So we have a nice record of it. Now, of course, it's, in Latin. Joan didn't speak Latin, and so what she says is being transferred to another language, and it's, of course, going to be a biased work because it's written out by these judges. But there is a sense that the guy in charge of the trial, a bishop named Pierre Cochon, had some misgivings about it, but said, I'm just following orders here, was kind of the defense of some of these clergy members. They are in English-held territory. They are doing what they're supposed to do. There were some expressions of regret after the fact from people like Cochon. And so you do have this sense that not everybody's super happy about it. This is something that's really played up in the film I had the poster from, The Passion of Joan of Arc. You have one figure in particular, who's one of the judges, who sympathizes with her. And he goes down to her prison cell and all of this. We don't know to what extent that's true, but that's definitely something that you can get a sense of from the sources we have available. So not everyone was just like, yeah, she's a witch, let's get rid of her. There probably were some real misgivings among some of those judges. Yeah.
What happens between France and Britain after she's executed? I mean, obviously we know that Dogbean remains in power, but what really happened?
The French keep winning some victories even after Joan loses some, and eventually by 1453 the French push the English out almost entirely. The English hold on to a little town called Calais, a port town, which they hold on to for the next 100 years, but after that they have no more presence, no more land in France. And because of that, the English become more English. They associate more with their own kind of national identity. And so it's actually a big shift because English kings for such a long time had been French speakers and had French land, and now they lose all that. They stop marrying French queens also.
So they lose Aquitaine and all of
Yeah, they lose it all. Yeah, by 1553 they have no more territory in France.
Do you by chance know what the reaction from the papacy was with her being burned at the stake?
Yeah, you know, that's something that I should know, and I don't know exactly what it is. But yeah, I'm curious as to if the Pope had any real reaction at all. The papacy at this time was kind of a mess, and so they may not have really done much or said much about it because there were all kinds of political problems within the papacy. But that's a good question and something that I will look into to kind of find out what's going on there. Yeah.
So do you have like any record where like other people would try to use this for like their own gains like during the history?
Yeah, if you look, there are so many examples. I just picked out these two because I thought they were pretty cool and interesting, but there are so many different ways that she's been used throughout the centuries, politically, kind of socially, and so on. A really good example that's a really good American example is she was used as a symbol of the suffragette movement in the early 20th century. And she was definitely sort of seen as the sign of women fighting for their rights. And Joan, she didn't talk about stuff like that. She didn't seemingly care about stuff like that. But her image is applied to that. And there's a big women's march on Washington, actually, in 1913. And the symbol of that march on all the programs was a woman on a white horse in armor. And so it's Joan of Arc, and someone actually dressed as Joan of Arc in that rally. And so that's probably the best example that I like to pull out.
I meant more of like, did they take like her model of like going to like a king and saying, oh, I have these voices in my head, we should go attack these?
No one's really using that. I mean, you have instances like that happening, people saying they've been divinely inspired and then trying to play some kind of political role. But Joan is definitely the most famous example of that I can think of, at least in Western civilization. But yeah, so most people, when they use her image, are not going to play up the voices from God part unless they're writing from a particularly Catholic perspective. Yeah.
Did her image ever get out of, say, like Western culture, or is it just only stayed firmly in Western culture?
There are, I think, I was just looking at something about this the other day. There was something, I think, where they were calling someone the Indian Joan of Arc from the Indian subcontinent. Now, I can't remember who it was, but outside of the West, there have been people associated with this idea of Joan of Arc. So female leaders being called the whatever Joan of Arc because they're kind of following, in a way, her example of kind of getting out there and fighting for justice or whatever. But it's mostly a Western symbol. Yeah, United States and Europe specifically. Yeah.
When she was captured by the Duchy of Burgundy, why did Charles not buy her freedom?
Because she had lost recently. Charles didn't like a loser, even though he was a former loser himself. He sees himself as a winner at that point. He doesn't need her. And so he basically cuts ties with her. It sounds very cruel. He was raked over the coals by some people for doing this. His reputation has suffered for hundreds of years because of this, but he simply didn't think he needed her anymore. And he didn't feel like paying for her because his money was running low, and so he just didn't. And so he didn't really think about what it would do to his reputation. And it's not going to matter all that much because he keeps winning after her death. And he becomes known by the French people as a pretty strong king who finally is able to cast out the English. So he made a bet here, and he won. But Joan comes out the big loser in the bet that Charles made. Thank you all so much.